Cuyo Blaster is a fun little game. It's bright and colourful, and everything about it, from its pre-release trailers to its title card to its opening stage, says don't take me too seriously. And if you want to enjoy the game, you do well to heed those words. If you do take it too seriously, on the other hand, you may come away a little disappointed. And what's rather strange about this game is, despite the cutesy initial impression, at times the game does seem to invite you to take it more seriously. This begins with a story. While a talking flying hamster scientist fighting worms from outer space may not seem like anything other than a silly excuse to fill the screen with wacky creations, the game seems to want it to be something more, with other characters looking like they'd be more at home in the original Doom, in more than one way, and lots of dialogue in a grittier style that jars awkwardly with the initial cutesy impression. And the dialogue isn't just awkward in terms of suitability, it's also horribly stilted. And not in a fun, all your base are belong to us style either, although those sorts of basic translation errors do crop up frequently enough. It's more in a my first self-published fanfiction by Timmy, aged 12.5 style. I'd actually be curious how these scenes read in Spanish, as I suspect even in the original they're probably equally inelegant. Not of course that any of this matters too much in a shmup, but in this case the character of the game looked to be a big selling point, and in these interludes at least, it's a big fat miss. But what about the actual in-game characters themselves? Well, they're numerous, that's for sure, and they're certainly all different from each other visually. We've got the aforementioned hamster, a tomato man, a shark thing, some gooey-looking hellspawn dog head. What connects them all is beyond me. They definitely exhibit the imagination and lack of inhibition few people are able to maintain beyond childhood, but they also exhibit the lack of focus and sophistication we associate with children too. They are, however, fun to play around with, and each comes with their own differently animated shot, ranging from standard lasers to fish being fired by the cat character. Here at Character Select, however, we come immediately face to face with the game's main visual problem, namely a very low-res image quality that renders the small rotating Character Select images as nothing more than vague blurs. Fortunately, in-game visuals are nowhere near that bad, but to call them crisp would be an exaggeration. Stylistically, the developers look to have taken a page, or three, from Cuphead. However, while that game's visual style was clearly the studied result of a seriously meticulous labour of love, this is more of a mishmash, with a lack of consistency being its most defining factor. That's not to say the visuals are bad or lack charm, quite the opposite. In fact, they display vibrancy and humour at every turn, and the backgrounds are both detailed and varied, with lots of motion making the world feel alive, as blades of grass wave in the wind, or, in one striking moment, a flock of birds fly silhouetted behind sunlit clouds. Perhaps even more so than backgrounds, however, I would say enemies are arguably the standout part of the game visually. There are a very large number of unique types, often featuring little visual gags, although again, that Cuphead inspiration can be a little too obvious, and this game can only suffer in such a comparison. Honestly though, while the visuals are interesting and definitely have character, it's hard to gather from them something that might meaningfully be called a Cuyo Blaster style. They remind me of lots of old Amiga games, which is great, I loved those games and that style, but they're more reminiscent of the type you'd borrow from your neighbour, have a bunch of fun with, then return and forget the name of, as opposed to the type that have become instantly recognisable classics. A further small visual problem is the occasional way enemy attacks can get lost in the backgrounds. This is especially prevalent in the second stage, where some angry wasps require continual focus or they'll take you out, leaving you feeling like you've been hit by an invisible bullet. These are made even worse in arcade mode, where a filter effect renders them almost imperceptible. Regular bullets and patterns, to be fair, are almost always far clearer. They're mostly of the fast-paced and sporadic classic shmup style, but now and then they do appear in more intense patterns, and some bullets float in slowly or erupt while halfway across the screen, giving the game some decent variety. Enemies usually come from in front of you, but they will sneak in from behind too, although this is signalled by a flashing red arrow. As with the earlier wasps, some attacks can feel unfair, and with no level select or practice mode, it can be a bit of a chore to work your way back to where you met these unsignalled attacks to learn them. Fortunately, the game is very generous with continues, and other than the last boss, where the difficulty spikes ludicrously, most main stages are a bit of a breeze. Too much of a breeze, in fact. After a couple of tries, the whole first half of the game comes to offer very little challenge, a massive part of the reason why making your way back to later levels feels like a chore. But I'm being overly negative. For the most part, the game is a lot of fun to play through. You have a few weapons at your disposal, and while the balancing does seem rather off at times, they make for some varied play. You have a standard forward shot that auto-fires and has a fairly wide spread. The damage this causes depends heavily on your character. You also have a bomb which can be charged up through 3 stages by collecting gems dropped by fallen enemies. Your bomb type can be selected at the same time as your character, and again, the damage they do and how they do it varies greatly, with some offering defensive side effects too. There's also a special meter which fills as you shoot enemies and auto-fires when its gauge fills, giving you little control over when it gets used, and leading to it frequently discharging when it's of no assistance. You have one other attack, a pulse, which turns all enemy shots on screen to gems. Used carefully, this can insta-charge your bomb to its highest level, and using these 2 mechanics in smart combos becomes key to survival later on. And survival, by the way, is very much the name of the game here. There are no real scoring mechanics worthy of the name. You get points for shooting enemies, and basically your final score is just a signifier of how far in the game you went. There is one little twist to the play that's not mentioned anywhere in the game, namely that when your bomb is at full power, if you keep collecting gems, you'll add to a counter in the bottom left of the screen, which will give you a 1-up when full. 1-ups can also be obtained at the end of every stage, where you can choose from a range of bonus options that also include a speed up, increasing your fire rate, or boosts to the items you find throughout the levels. These items come in 2 types. One is a pink pea, which gives you 1 charge for your pulse, up to a maximum of 3. The others are different weapons that will switch out for your main shot until their limited amount of ammo runs out. These include machine gun style fast shots early on, but in later stages become homing missiles or lasers that give you a massive advantage. So much so in fact that there are certain bosses who, if you arrive at them with the right shot and a couple of pulses in the bag, can be destroyed in seconds, but who become near impossible with just the standard shot. Now, some games do this sort of thing deliberately, but here I'm not quite so sure. The Stage 6 boss in particular feels like the developers just didn't clock how their own mechanics could be used to waste the guy by unleashing a continuous tsunami of supercharged attacks. Conversely, some big enemies come at you early on in stages with tough attacks and bullet sponge levels of health before any pickups have become available, leaving you to struggle through a war of attrition feeling underpowered and frustrated, especially if you've already played the game a few times over and know that a few seconds later you're going to be inundated with pickups to be used on nothing more than a few waves of popcorn enemies. These issues are not game-breakingly serious, but they do contribute to a real feeling that power-ups have just been chucked in any old place, and overall the game suffers from half-hearted balancing and a lack of finesse. Nowhere is this more true than the last boss. I won't spoil him here, but that fight just feels grossly unfair, with some underhand patterns and attacks that leave you shaking your head thinking, that's stupid, rather than, I'll make note of that for next time. And this is not the only frustration. There are a half-dozen little things that just don't seem to have been given enough attention. The weird way the continue menu operates, the way the meters at the bottom of the screen can block your ship, the skipped frames that occur at the start of every level. Then there are things that do seem intentional but leave you wondering if they were really thought through. The lack of weapon choices in easy mode, for example, which makes certain sections harder to play through on beginner than any other difficulty, or the fact that you can hide inside boss sprites, thus avoiding entire attack patterns completely. And this vague idea of, is it really supposed to be this way, comes to your mind just a little too often. As mentioned, different characters do different amounts of damage, and while in most games these options each come with pros and cons that play into the hands of different playstyles, here weak but fast characters simply cannot take out some waves of enemies no matter what you do, and unlike slow but powerful characters can't have their flaw mitigated by any end of level bonuses. In fact, I'm sure most players, despite the wealth of characters and bomb options available, will all quickly come to settle on the same 1 or 2, as they are just objectively the best ways to set up if you want to beat the game. And in terms of beating the game, we have 2 difficulties on offer straight off the bat, beginner and normal. After finishing beginner, you can play in arcade mode with extra stages, the regular game already having a decent 8, although these extra stages are probably the weakest in the game. After finishing normal, a hard mode opens up. One high score from each mode is recorded in the high score menu separately, and there's another little oddity here, with scores being recorded no matter how many continues you used, but continues giving you huge point penalties, usually far higher than it would even be possible to score, meaning essentially scores are for one continue only. But why not actually set that up instead of having this odd system? Other than that, there's not much to keep you coming back. Even the options are pretty bare bones, with nothing but basic sound options and the controls, which shouldn't even really be there given they don't allow for button configuration. Musically, there's not a lot to say. The BGM has a good schmuppy bounce to it, and the menu music is really catchy. I liked a lot of the tracks, but they're not the type that'll have you rushing out to pick up the soundtrack. So all in all, we have a fun but simple little side-scroller. It doesn't do anything majorly wrong, and it doesn't do anything particularly stand out either. Like I said at the top, you're going to enjoy this more the less seriously you treat it. Viewed in competition with recent releases like Rolling Gunner are hugely inferior. But viewed as a fun little side dish to accompany those games, it does a decent job. It's a shame more time wasn't spent balancing and refining the mechanics on offer, but as a relatively budget release, it's worth checking out if you're looking for something a bit different. Overall, I'd call it a respectable but flawed attempt, and score it 6.5 out of 10. Well, that is it for this one. Thanks for watching, hope it was useful. Let us know if you've tried the game and what you thought if you did, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.